a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, careerists, workaholics, goal setters, and strivers. I'm Brooke Warner, one half of this Memoir Nation show. As always, I'm here with my trusted co-host, Grant Faulkner. And today, Grant, is the final show of our 7th season. So congratulations and happy birthday. We're 7.
Yeah, woohoo. Are we heading into 2nd grade now, maybe? I don't know. I lose track. But that's so amazing. And to me, it seems like yesterday when you asked me to join you in a podcasting venture. And I very naively said, sure, if it only entails showing up and talking. And I don't know, that moment is just so interesting to me because it's just one of those moments where little did I know how much I had to learn. And it's been so much more than showing up and talking, of course. But that said, it's with learning and teaching in our conversation, it's very appropriate that today's show features John B. King, who's written a book called Teacher by Teacher. And it's a book that's not exclusively focused on his career trajectory, but largely so. And so, definitely appropriate to close out our season honoring work stories and how our work passions fuel us and define us. Just feels spot on. And John is a great guest to have this discussion with. And Brooke, each of us have confessed on this show several times that we're workaholics. And that's something that's easy to confess as Americans because it's somewhat expected, or at least it's understood and even admired in some circles, though not all for sure. And having read John King's book, there's no doubt that we've got a fellow workaholic guest on the show today with some serious credentials. And he's a man who started his own charter school in New York City, and then he became Barack Obama's Secretary of Education. And he's currently chancellor of the State University of New York, SUNY. So he's definitely pulled some long hours, and which he writes about. And Brooke, I'm curious about the pros and the cons of being a workaholic for you.
Interesting question. I do have some thoughts on this. Like, on the one hand, if you're a workaholic and you really love what you do and you're passionate about tending to your purpose through work, then work doesn't always feel like work. And that happens for me. I actually think I'm privileged on that front. It feels like a bigger calling. And so there's a pro, I guess, in that aspect. Not so much that I think it's necessarily a good thing that I work as much as I do, but I love what I do and I want to put in the hours and I feel driven, although sometimes not always tirelessly, and yet the definition of a workaholic, I looked it up, is a person who works compulsively, and compulsively is not exactly a positive word. It actually said that it's a workaholic is someone who experiences an inability to limit the amount of time they spend on work, despite negative consequences, such as damage to their relationships or health. Oops. So no.
Should I ask a follow-up question there, Brooke?
Right. So, when I was young, I dated a Spanish guy for a while, 5 years, actually. He was my first love. And the Spaniards have a saying that Americans live to work and Spaniards work to live. And I've never forgotten that because the older I get, the more I see that as true to my own experience. I do see myself as living to work. But I have also told friends and family over the years that I'm very grateful to be a mom because one thing that pulls me out of work is my son. Like I actually have, I think, pretty good work-life balance because of him. We do a ton of adventures. We get out a lot. We take a lot of trips. So, I have 4 more years till he graduates and then I don't know what's going to happen. But that's where you are, Grant. Kids out of the house, hustling, starting new ventures, writing, publishing, teaching. What do you think about your own workaholism in those terms?
All the more opportunity for workaholism
yeah, exactly.
now. I can just indulge in it, and
no one to pull you away.
Yeah, so we definitely live mirror lives in this regard, Brooke. So much that I just every once in a while when we talk about this, I'm like, are we scaring off listeners? Do they just think we're like total maniacs? But I also, I love what I do, and so often my work, like you, it doesn't feel like work. I like your sense of it as a bigger calling. Because it definitely excites me. And sometimes the time I get in a flow and time just, goes away because I'm so immersed in it. On the other hand, though, my wife, Heather, and I, we make these somewhat depressing jokes about how the whole Bay Area seems to be out doing what we call California living, which means going to wineries and hiking and going to great shows and indulging in weekend getaways and surfing. Whereas, we spend the whole weekend cooped up writing. And strangely enough, though, the thing with me is that I find that I'm most at peace when I work and my mind calms down when I'm working to the point that I don't in some ways I don't like to be at rest because then everything, fires up somewhat uncomfortably. And I guess that is a definition of workaholism unto itself, that I'm essentially looking for a fix. So I definitely relate to the Spanish saying you mentioned. I basically believe that one should work to live, not live to work, but that actually takes practice. And I used to be good at it, but I practice working a lot, so much so that it's just what I like doing the best for the most part.
Yeah, I hear you. And this is a good topic because our work lives really occupy more of our waking hours than our personal lives. And that's even true for Spaniards with full-time jobs, by the way. And so the career and work memoirs are something I've gravitated toward over the years. I like to read about how people fall into the work that they do. Sometimes you have books like the one that we're going to talk about today, Teacher by Teacher, which is focused on the rise of John and his profession. But other times there are books that are about the work that people fall into, or maybe they don't even want to have, like Made by Stephanie Land. When I was at Seal Press, we published a couple of different sex worker memoirs. And of course, that's a type of career and an interesting one because people have very strong feelings about whether or not that's an empowering thing to do, or the degree to which women have agency in that kind of work. And then a lot of people who are famous for what they do, of course, have written memoirs, comedians, journalists, chefs, and actually, Grant, one of my favorite memoirs in that space is Blood, Bones, and Butter by Gabrielle Hamilton. It's such a well-written book, and food writers are so good when they're good, and so it's also interesting, like we've seen memoirs by actors, of course, and other public figures. And I recently wrote on Substack about my challenged relationship with the celebrity memoir. And in the aftermath, I got a couple people who reached out to me to tell me about celebrity memoirs that they felt really stood out, in part because they are more literary in nature and they really did fit the definition of memoir as opposed to autobiography, which was something that I was kind of taking issue with. And so I wanted to give a shout out to a couple of those, the ones that people brought to my attention. Sally Field's memoir, In Pieces, which gets into her challenging childhood and her transformation from TV roles to more acclaimed dramatic performances. And then someone mentioned Roger Ebert's Life Itself, which is about his cancer experience. And so I thought that was just interesting that people said, wait, there are a few you want to take a look at. And I was curious, Grant, if there's any career or work memoirs that jump out as impactful or memorable to you.
It's funny. I don't think there are any, but I used to read a lot of biographies of writers. And I think one of the main reasons I read them was because I was curious about their career trajectory. And I also loved the stories of how they worked and under, what conditions. And I think sometimes we think that all of our favorite writers are always kind of in these ideal situations of writing. But, like William Faulkner, he was so prolific and wrote so much in part because he had all these dependents beyond his wife and daughter to take care of. So he had to make money, and he wrote a lot just to make money. And same with Charles Dickens, who wrote a lot because he was paid by the word, in his serialized stories. And then there are writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald who had to sell out to Hollywood to make enough money to support his family. But all these like weird and sometimes trying life experiences also could produce interesting and unexpected art, And so that's what interested me, I guess, about their creative space in these unlikely environments. And I've certainly had many moments when I've had to compromise things to essentially earn a buck. And even now, my work to help others write, that has eclipsed my own writing by quite a bit. And no complaints, it's just reality, and one that I also enjoy. So how does John King's memoir hold up for you on this front, Brooke? Would you consider it an impactful career memoir?
I would, yeah. And I think it's a book that's honoring a legacy because John King's parents were educators. And he comes at this book, which I would qualify as a kind of a hybrid memoir, only because it is his story, but it's also a book that traces one man's educational journey to make certain points about belonging, legacy, progress, equity. And so, but I guess by which I mean, it touches upon teaching and issues of race in such a way that kind of extend a little bit beyond memoir for me. But for some of the more touching stories, that people would see and hear, I would say they're focused a lot around John's openness and curiosity and how he shows the trajectory of his own young life impacted by teachers and mentors, encouragement, second chances. And his story is really interesting to follow because each step led him to the next best thing, but that was never guaranteed, of course. And he was given opportunities, but he's also a Black and Puerto Rican man, and he writes a lot about race and his own racial awakening and education. And when I finished the book, I honestly felt deep compassion. I said to my wife, actually, if you and I are struggling with what's going on in the Trump administration, dismantling everything, just imagine how John B. King must feel. And that was probably like one of the main things I was left with, like, ugh, all this work that he and others have done, and just to have it all, I don't know, threatened in the way that it is right now.
Yeah, I was going to say listeners should know that we're interviewing John on the day that news broke that the Supreme Court has granted Trump the authority to carry out, these mass layoffs at the Department of Education. And, for me, I was actually thinking that I've heard the threats to get rid of the Department of Education from every Republican president since Ronald Reagan, or anybody who's run for the presidency in the Republican Party. So essentially my entire life, but they've never come close to doing it. So I just kind of thought it was one of those things that was actually safe. But within 2 hours of the Supreme Court ruling, the Department of Education sent notices to employees indicating it is immediately resuming its plans to shrink the department. And, one thing that's at stake is the separation of powers. And Justice Sotomayor said an agency like this can ordinarily only be dismantled only by Congress, so it's not a ruling that agrees with that. And then John talks about this at greater length in our interview in a really interesting way, but the consequences are going to be grave because the Department of Education, if you don't know, gives federal aid to schools. It manages federal aid for college students and ensures compliance with civil rights laws, including ensuring that schools accommodate, students with disabilities. So it's a dark, dark day in my book.
Yeah, it's sort of tough to be ending on this as we head into our summer break. But I will say, just by way of hope that, and John King evokes this quote, of course, in his own book that Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And people have been saying that a lot lately. Mm-hmm. I've actually heard other folks on, podcasts and shows that I listen to. And he also writes about Barack Obama's spirit of hope, which is so intrinsic to who he is. Teacher by Teacher just came out in April. So to read this book is honestly to have a little bit of a heartache for all the efforts of the Obama administration. For me, is a bit of nostalgia as well. But also it made me tap into hope, which is really important, and made me acutely aware of how much we stand to lose, how much we will lose. But I'll reiterate this, reading memoirs outside your lived experience will change you. They'll make you better people, more empathetic, more understanding. I'm excited for this interview because John King is going to leave us in a good place with some actual things that you all can do in terms of action items you can take that aren't that hard. It's not just about voting, of course, but calling your representatives, going to school board meetings, things like that. So it's truly an honor to have him on the show today, and we'll get to hear more about his life and service after this short break.
Hello, writers. I'm here to tell you some good news. Memoir Nation, the new writing endeavor that Brooke and I have been working on for a year now, is now live. And so many people, I've heard this over the years, they say, I'm going to write my story someday. But someday tends to kind of always be off in the distance. And we're here to help you start writing your story today. We're providing the inspiration, the guidance, the structure, and support to equip you creatively, emotionally, and psychologically, and perhaps more to write your life story. And there are several packages of support and inspiration that you can sign up for, but I'm going to spotlight one for you now as a listener to our podcast. Out of the gate, the $99 level of membership is going to give you a lot of perks, including a weekly newsletter with lots of memoir insights and tips and advice and encouragement. And it will also get you the bonus podcast content and a code for a free future class of your choosing. So it's a really good deal for $99, but also important to us is that it's support we need to launch this thing, get it off the ground, make it sustainable. And if you've been a longtime listener and you like the content you get on this show, there's going to be a lot more growth and exciting things in the weeks weeks and months and years to come. So we invite you to join us at this $99 subscriber level. Check out the other levels, though. They might be better for you. We've done this podcast for more than 6 years now, and we've actually done it entirely for free and as a labor of love, and we do love it, but we'd also love your support as we expand the ways we help writers tell their stories. So we'll make it worth your while, we promise, and we thank you in advance for supporting us to create the space we're dreaming of for writers like you. Visit memoirnation.com.
Welcome back, everyone. We are so pleased to have John B. King Jr. on the show with us today. John served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. Over the course of his extensive and influential career in public education, he has been a high school social studies teacher, a middle school principal, the first African-American and Puerto Rican to serve as New York State Education Commissioner, a college professor, and the president and CEO of the Education Trust, which is a national education civil rights organization. John is currently the chancellor of the State University of New York, SUNY, which is the nation's largest comprehensive system of public higher education. Both of his parents were career New York City public school educators, which is part of what your book is about, John. You're joining us from Brooklyn, where you live with your wife and your 2 daughters. Welcome. We're just so happy to have you.
Thanks so much. Excited to talk with you both.
Well, you found yourself on a show called Memoir Nation. So I'm curious if we could start by asking you if you set out to write a memoir specifically, or what you thought this book was going to be when you first endeavored to write it, and why did you write it?
Yeah. So, you should write a book is a thing that people say sometimes, and you think to yourself, no, that's not really something I want to do. But then I had this situation where I came to know the family who are the owners of the property where my great-grandfather was enslaved. And they are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved my family. And the Washington Post did a story about our relationship and our conversations. And a book agent reached out to the person who wrote the article and said, do you want to write a book about this? And he was working on a different book project, and he said, no, but you should call John, see if he wants to do a book. And so it really it came to me in that sense. And when they reached out about a book project, my first thought was, I want to write a book that says thank you to teachers, because teachers made such a huge difference in my life. And I've had the blessing of a career where I've gotten to meet so many amazing teachers. And so I really started out with the idea that this was going to be a love letter to teachers. And that, of course, starts with my own experiences. And so that it sort of evolved into a memoir from there.
Well, that's so interesting, the thank you to teachers and a love letter to teachers, because, you obviously, you worked in the Obama administration, and that puts you in a place of great esteem, but also now unfortunate sympathy. And I say that because this is such a challenging time with so much dismantling of the good work and the thank you to teachers that you poured your heart into for so many years. So can you tell us what the impacts of, the mass layoffs at the Department of Education will mean for our country and for our students?
It's awful. I mean, it's heartbreaking knowing the people, right? And thinking about these former teachers and principals who've committed their lives to public service, who came to the federal government to try to make a positive difference. And just to see them treated so horribly with such cruelty is just personally heartbreaking. And then it's heartbreaking for the country, because for decades, we've had a bipartisan consensus that education is a national imperative. And this administration is walking away from that. And there's a real threat to the day-to-day functioning of education across the country in 4 ways. One, the department gets resources to high-needs kids. The Title I program that provides funding for low-income students, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding that gets resources to students with disabilities. If the department isn't there, will those funds still be there? Because without those funds, we can expect teacher layoffs, larger class sizes, fewer services for students, fewer AP classes, fewer enrichment activities. Second, the department is responsible for our financial aid system. Pell Grants that make college possible for low-income students, our federal student loan program that makes college accessible for low and middle income families. If the department isn't there, will those programs continue to operate? Will we continue to be a country that provides real opportunities for social mobility? So I worry about that. Third, the Office for Civil Rights is responsible for ensuring that districts and states honor student civil rights. It's the place you go if you're experiencing discrimination on the basis of race or sex or disability. A huge number of the complaints that OCR, the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights, processes are complaints from families who have a kid with a disability and their school is refusing to provide them with the services they need. What will be their recourse? And they've already laid off many of the people who work at the OCR. They've shut down some of the regional offices. So I worry that people will send in those complaints and they won't get addressed. They won't get resolved. Their kids won't get what they need. The fourth area is information. The department is the place that does things like the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It helps us understand, where are we doing well? Where are we struggling? Where do we need to intervene? Now we'll be potentially flying blind if that information isn't available, if we don't have the research that the department supports around good practice. So I'm very distressed. And I'll tell you, Margaret Spellings, who was George W. Bush's Secretary of Education, she and I have done a number of events together recently. She is as distressed as I am. This is not a partisan issue. This is about whether you believe that education should be important to the country.
Well, thank you for that. It's so important for our listeners to hear it. And we're so, all of us, of course, like deeply impacted by education in all kinds of ways that we don't even think about until it's threatened. I do want to introduce our listeners to some of the stories that you tell in the book, because a lot of it is about all the countless people who supported you along the way, opened doors for you, encouraged you. And you thank one teacher in particular in the book and in your acknowledgments, Mr. Osterwild, for changing your life. And I was curious, given your role as an educator, how often do you hear stories like this about a single teacher changing the trajectory of a student's life?
So often, when you really push people on sort of like, how'd you get to where you are? What made the difference for you? Particularly folks who grew up, as I did, in challenging circumstances. Oftentimes, they will come back to that single teacher. In fact, people will say, it was my 10th grade English teacher. It was my 7th grade math teacher. It was my 3rd grade teacher. For me, Mr. Oswald was my teacher after my mom passed in October of my 4th grade year. I was living with my dad. My dad was struggling with Alzheimer's, and nobody knew. It was just the two of us. And so home was a scary, unstable environment. And Mr. Osterwild created this classroom space that was truly magical. It's like Miss Frizzle from Magic School Bus come to life. It was a classroom where we read the New York Times every day. We did productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did a production of Alice in Wonderland, where I was the rose with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. And those experiences, that level of engagement was so crucial for me because home was so hard and so isolating. And in school, I could be a kid when I wasn't able to be a kid at home. And it was such a gift. And he ended up looping with us. So he stayed with us for 5th grade and 6th grade, which is very unusual in the New York City schools of the time. And so it's not an overstatement to say I am alive today because I had Mr. Osterwild as my teacher at PS 276 in Canarsie.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, John. Well, in addition to, writing about teaching in your own career trajectory and figures like Mr. Oswald, you share so many powerful, poignant stories about race and your own consistent awakening to what kind of country we live in and how Black and brown people are treated. And I was particularly taken by the story you told about going to the school where Philando Castile worked in the aftermath of his murder by police who stopped him for what should have been a routine traffic stop. And you write about gathering with teachers and administrators and others to talk about what he meant to that community and about how the people in the room, who were mostly white, were sympathetic about what happened, but you felt not necessarily empathetic. And so I was wondering if you can say more about that distinction and what you hope to convey by sharing this anecdote in your book.
Yeah, it was such a painful moment. Philando worked in the cafeteria of a Montessori school, a public Montessori school in St. Paul. And when he was killed by the police officer, there was incredible outrage and frustration in the community and so much pain in the school because the kids all knew him. They called him Mr. Phil. He had relationships with the kids and families, and there's a lot of heartbreak. And I was sitting with this group of parents and teachers and administrators, really just to mourn with them and to express President Obama's condolences. And I was struck that there's a way in which, especially in Minnesota, folks see themselves as nice, like this is a nice place to live. And there was this dissonance of that self-perception of niceness with the fact that Philando had been stopped dozens of times by the police, often pretextual stops. There was a conflict between that notion of niceness and the fact that he was killed wrongly by this police officer. And folks were struggling with the dissonance of that. There was a moment where one of his colleagues sort of described how frequently he'd been stopped by the police. And I remember he was so raw, and he's describing it, and he actually got down on his knees to describe how the officers treated him, talked to him when he got stopped, and how degrading the experience had been one of the times that he was stopped. And I could see people kind of watching him, and it was jarring, but it wasn't quite breaking through. And then one of the administrators said, a white woman said, I want to speak. I grew up in this community, and I never interacted with the police ever, my whole life, until I started dating my now husband, who is Black. And then we got stopped all the time. And I could see when she said that, it was sort of like a validation of what people had been hearing from the folks of color in the room. And it was sort of a breakthrough moment in the conversation. And I've thought a lot about that moment because it is so hard to sort of have empathy across lines of difference. And we need sometimes people who could be a bridge. And in that moment, she was a bridge. And it was a very powerful conversation, a lot of pain in the room. When we ended the conversation, one of the parents said, my kids, a white parent said, my kids' view about race has been things were bad. Then Martin Luther King came. Everything was better. And I know now I need to have a different conversation with my kid because I understand we still have a lot of work to do. And that to me was painful to hear, but also encouraging in the sense that there was this realization of how much work that community and our country needs to do to grapple with the role that race still plays in our society.
I really appreciated how much you were willing to tackle stories of race in the book. And of course, it's your lived experience. But they were these arresting anecdotes. And you mentioned at the outset here about this relationship that you've struck up with the Beckers, the living ancestors of the people who owned your ancestors, who were enslaved persons. And that entire storyline really just, I don't think you can read it without it hitting hard, and perhaps, just also with so much emotion, and it's so wrought with conflict. And in the book, you depict them. I mean, I guess they are pro-Confederate and not having ever come to terms truly with their own history. And I was just thinking about how powerful it is, this blindness that comes with living the life that you're born into. And you're essentially saying that oppressed people in this equation don't have the luxury of blindness. And I'm curious, why was it important to you to cultivate this friendship with the Beckers? And what do you think is the most important lesson that you got from that experience?
Well, let me say, they are wonderful people. They are lovely, lovely people. They've been very welcoming to us. The backstory is that I was invited to give the commencement address at University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where my grandmother graduated in 1894. And in preparation for the speech, I decided to do this family research project and got help from a woman who was a genealogist at the Schomburg, the part of the New York City Public Library that does work on African-American history. And she discovered that not only could we identify the place where my great-grandfather was enslaved, and think about that, great-grandfather, right? So there's a kid being babysat right now by their great-grandfather. That's not very far. Not only could we identify the place, but the cabin that my great-grandfather lived in, still standing on the property, and the property continuously owned by this one family. And it was only 25 miles from my house. I was living then in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is in Gaithersburg, Maryland. So, when we showed up, and literally my cousin knocked on the door, said, I'm Jan King Robinson, and my people were enslaved here. They welcomed us. The Beckers welcomed us, and they've welcomed this conversation. But I've been struck many times as we built a real friendship that they didn't have to, just as you're describing, Brooke, they didn't have to think about the cruelty of the institution of slavery. They referred to the cabin, which is about 30 feet from the main house, as the quarters. Right? So they grew up amidst the artifacts of the institution of slavery, but again, hadn't focused on what it meant. In fact, in one conversation, they asked us, or it said to us, we hope that our people weren't cruel to your people. And so we had to have this conversation to say, I understand what you mean. You hope that your ancestors didn't torture our ancestors, but of course, owning people is torture. Slavery is cruelty. And so that's jarring. And I could see the pain that they felt sort of coming to grapple with their ancestors, what they were a part of. But, it's been a relationship that has grown over time. There's a burial ground on the property for a cemetery for their ancestors with big headstones, including marking their ancestors who served in the Confederacy. And then there's an unmarked burial ground where my ancestors are buried. And they now are working with some experts to try to identify the exact places so that there can be markers. And so I've really seen them now really embrace grappling with this history. I think if there's a takeaway for me, it's about the work we have to do as a country. If you go to Germany, there are plaques on houses to say the name of the Jewish family that lived there, that was taken from there, whose home was taken as part of the Holocaust. Whereas in the United States, we still have statues to Confederate generals. So we haven't done the work, I don't believe, as a country to really examine what happened and its legacy.
That's such a riveting and disturbing and opening story. I feel like that just tells the story of where we are as a country in so many different ways, that so many people, well-intentioned, are still skating on the surface, which is all the more reason we need the curriculum and the history that the education department would hopefully bring to us. So yeah, that's just such a meaningful story. And you write about graduations and loving graduations, and that graduations are your favorite part of your job. And also, I thought it was really interesting that the best ones happen in prison, according to you, and that you make a point to write about how higher education in prison and why that's good for public safety and society more broadly. And I've done some work with incarcerated writers, and I have to say it's probably some of the most meaningful work that I've done. Some of the most inspiring. So I was wondering if you can share more about this.
One of the things I'm most proud of about our work in the Obama administration was a small initiative, but with a huge impact, which was this program called Second Chance Pell. And it really grew out of the president's My Brother's Keeper initiative, focused on addressing the particular challenges faced by boys and young men of color, on the theory that if we address the challenges they face, we can solve bigger societal challenges. And one of the things that we identified as a real problem was that in the 94 crime bill, there were many bad policies, but one of the dumbest was taking away Pell Grants for folks who are incarcerated. So again, Pell Grants are the main funding for low-income folks to access higher education. And when Pell Grants were cut off for folks who are incarcerated, programs in prisons all over the country closed overnight, higher ed programs. I remember talking with one woman who was incarcerated at the time who said the guards came and they took books out of the library and said, "You won't need these anymore." And it was a reflection of that kind of tough on crime ethos of the mid-90s. But of course, it's actually dumb on crime, because 95% of the people who are incarcerated are coming home. The only question is how, right? And we know that if you participate in any educational program while incarcerated, you're 40% less likely to return to prison. So this was terrible public policy. We knew we couldn't persuade Congress to change the law. So we created a pilot program under our experimental authority under the Higher Education Act to allow 65 colleges and universities to use Pell Grants to provide higher education in prison programs. And then over the years, since the administration ended, civil rights groups, criminal justice reform groups have brought members of Congress, governors, legislators to see these programs. And that effort has been so successful that pilot turned into the law finally being changed in 2020. And now Pell Grants have been restored for folks who are incarcerated. At SUNY, we're the largest provider of higher education in prison. And what's so amazing about those graduations is folks are transformed by the educational experience. They are personally transformed. Their prospects for when they come home of being able to contribute to their families, their communities, are transformed. And at the graduation, you see their immense pride. We called it Second Chance Pell, but many of the folks never had a first chance for a variety of reasons in their lives. And now they get this chance. And for some people, they made horrible mistakes. They did terrible things, but they grapple with that, maybe in a philosophy class, maybe in a sociology class, and they come out of that educational experience changed. And at the graduation, you see that. And you also see their parents, their partners, their kids, who now see them differently. I remember one guy at Sing Sing who told me, "This is the first time that I've had moral and academic credibility with my family." Right? His whole relationship with his kids was changed by him pursuing higher education while incarcerated. So those graduations, they are amazing. The faculty members always say it's some of the best teaching they've done, because the students are so focused and passionate and have to work really hard, because the schedule in prison, actually, there's a lot of things that you're asked to do. And you really have to be focused to say, you're gonna focus on studying. You're gonna study with all the noise and all the things that are going on. You're gonna focus on your own growth, and it's really inspiring work.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And we're moving into our final question here, and we have to close on what's going on around us. It's just such a tough time in education right now, from public education to higher education and everything in between. But not to mention book bans, takeovers of school boards, parents getting over involved in all kinds of decision making that is pretty historically unprecedented, and backlash to DEI initiatives. And so what would you advise to someone who's feeling despairing, as you said you are too right now? Is there anything, our listeners who are just lovers of reading and writing and education, what are actions that everyday people can take to try to push back against all this backsliding?
One, we should be hopeful, because there are great things happening in schools all across the country every day. And there are kids whose lives are being saved, and there are schools that are joyful, intellectually engaging, inspiring places. We aren't necessarily very good at scale, and so we struggle. Every problem is being solved somewhere by somebody, and we're not so good at spreading those solutions, but at least we can take hope from the fact that those solutions are out there. I think people have to organize. They really have to figure out, how am I going to vote in the school board election, show up at school board meetings, vote for state legislative candidates, study what their positions are in education, call them, reach out to them, members of Congress. Look, at the end of the day, it's Congress that decides whether or not Title I funds continue, whether or not Pell Grants continue. It's Congress that will decide whether or not there's an education department. So members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, their phones should be ringing off the hook with people saying, I care about education. I want you to do the right thing here. This is about your constituents. And, back in May, we had Teacher Appreciation Week. And Teacher Appreciation Week is lovely. It's a time to celebrate teachers. Lots of teachers get Starbucks gift cards, which is wonderful. But I need people, and I would implore people, don't just give the gift card. Vote like you love teachers. Show up at the school board meeting like you love teachers. Nudge your legislators like you love teachers. All right? Be a part of the solution on these issues.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We'll be right back with today's Book Alley.
Well, Grant, today on Book Alley, we're featuring a book called Fairyboy, Growing Up Gay and Out in Pre-Stonewall New York and Beyond by Garrett Glaser. And one of the reasons we chose this book, or that I did because it was in my pile of books here, is because it's another author whose book is centered in identity. And in this case, it's the author's gay identity.
Yeah, there's so many memoirs that tackle outsider identities, and for good reason, because there are a lot of outsiders in our culture, or they're viewed as outsiders. And I love that through memoir that we get to feel, secondhand at least, what it is like to step into the shoes of another person, be that a person who's not the same race or ethnicity as us, or the same sexual orientation as us, or who might have limitations or traumas or sorrows that are different from our own. So, I always view memoir as both a space where we can converge around things we relate to and things we totally don't relate to, and yet we find common ground there anyway. And that's really its power. So Brooke, Fairyboy is self-published, and you worked with Garrett for a while as his writing coach. So what's it like to see someone's published book after you've played this kind of role?
It's really the best part of what I do. Of course, because I'm a publisher, I see a lot of published books. So it's not a novelty by any stretch of the imagination, but still, I do love to see the published books, and I love it when authors get their published books. I see all the She Writes books because, of course, I publish them and I get copies of them. So it's kind of fun when someone I've worked with a long time ago finally finishes their book and sends it to me, which was the case here. And I also know how meaningful it is to each and every author to see their work in print. So I was just, particularly pleased to see this one because Garrett worked really hard on it and I was there firsthand.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about Fairyboy.
Yeah, so Garrett Glaser is a veteran journalist who takes readers on this very deeply personal journey through growing up gay in the 1950s and 60s in Manhattan, which is really fun. Manhattan really is a character in the book. Mm-hmm. And it was a time when queerness wasn't just taboo, but dangerous. And Garrett realized that he was gay when he was just 11 years old, and he was going to school at the elite prep school Dalton, all the while navigating shame and secrecy and yearning. And then he comes out to his mom when he's 14, and her response is to send him to therapy, hopefully to cure him of his homosexuality, but that does not work. He does not get cured, and instead he ventures into the shadowy corners of New York's underground gay culture. And there he sees, the earliest flickers of the gay liberation movement, including the first Christopher Street Liberation Day March and a Central Park Gay Inn. So there's a lot of great gay history in here. I love the story from the get-go just because of how much Garrett knew who he was from early on and really refused to live in the shadows. And then as he gets older, his path leads him to the world of broadcast journalism. And then he rose through the ranks at major networks like ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then in 1994, he made history as the first local TV news reporter in the U.S. to come out publicly on air. And that was a decision that solidified his integrity and cemented his role as a trailblazer. And that's what this book is about. So it's really quite an important story.
Definitely. That's total trailblazing, and speaking of Garrett's journalism career, if you're interested in this book, you can actually watch a segment on Como News Online called Garrett Glaser's new book explores hidden world of gay New York before Stonewall Riots. And we'll post the link in the show notes on this one. It's just a fascinating story and obviously an important book. And just like so many of the books we cover on the show. And we're so grateful for all the ways we are exposed to the lives and experiences of the memoirs we read and the authors we interview. And listeners, as Brooke said at the outset of today's show, this is our final show of our 7th year. For those who've been listening to us for a while, we choose our favorite episodes of the year to rerun in August, and we call these our mashup episodes, and it gives us a chance to get a little August break as we gear up for our next season. So we're going to continue to bring you amazing guests in year 8, and we're working hard to make Memoir Nation, the community, a place where you will make connections and be your go-to spot for all things memoir. Just go to memoirnation.com. So thanks for being loyal listeners, everyone, and happy summer. We hope you'll tune in August to see the guest pairings we decide to run, and we'll be back with our new season on September 1st.